All right, I think we've got enough people, so let's get going. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm Adam. My co-researcher is Katie. We did an exploratory study on how hate speech manifests on Facebook and Twitter. And in this presentation, we'll briefly describe what guided us, how we went about it, and some thought-provoking findings that came out of it. Please do ask questions in the chat as they occur to you, or make comments to share your insights. We'll address any outstanding questions at the end. And given that this is about social media, it'll be highly appropriate to use any of the reactions available to you while we're presenting. So social media platforms rely heavily on algorithms to automatically detect and remove hate speech. In the case of Facebook, algorithms are responsible for 97% of what gets taken down. However, takedown rates are low, and more than 95% of hate speech goes undetected and actually remains online. The prevalence of this remaining hate speech is distributed in such a way that, on average, 3 in 10,000 pieces of content are hateful. So we were intrigued by what we would find through manual observations in mainstream social media. Who are the targets of this remaining hate speech, and in what ways has it manifested to avoid automatic detection? We hypothesized that algorithms would generally be able to filter out the most egregious examples of hate speech, and that what we would find would be more covert and would contain features that resulted in non-detection, particularly related to language, local contexts, and deliberate adaptations by the perpetrators. Our first challenge, however, was in defining hate speech. So I've just dropped a link in the chat. If you can try make your way there, and then just rapid fire into the first 4 words that come to mind when you hear the term hate speech. If you can only think of 3 or 2, that's fine. And we'll give you about 30 seconds or so for that. Maybe a bit more because you actually need to get to that page. And if it's not working for anyone, you can also just drop in the chat that something's not happening. Okay, you get some results. I'm going to guess that's one person's result, or everyone's just hive mind.
Nice. Okay, cool. So racism coming through strong, homophobia, prejudice, slur. And then, okay, got a couple: divisive, aggression, offensive, threat, bigotry, anger, ignorance. Nice.
Football.
Okay. Football, yes. Okay, I'm going to go to just pop back to where we were and go to our definition. So hate speech is a very contested term and has many definitions. In legislation, it typically refers to utterances that incite harm or violence towards particular social groups. But in everyday discourse, the term is applied in a more generic way and may include expressions that foster prejudice and intolerance, or that simply raise concerns in terms of civility and respect for others. For the purpose of this assignment, we adopted a broader definition of hate speech as provided by Davidson et al. Here, hate speech is language that is used to express hatred towards a target group that is intended to be derogatory, to humiliate, or to insult members of the group. Because online hate speech is a manifestation of hegemony on social media, these utterances are typically directed at individuals or groups on the basis of race, sex, gender, sexual orientation, and so forth. As such, the hate targets that we chose to include are based on the hate categories described by Mondel et al., which have been summarized on screen. So that's that last block over there. The conceptual framework we selected is based on Wasim et al.'s typology of abusive language, in which abusive language is categorized across 2 dimensions, namely the target of abuse, which can be direct or generalized and is on the vertical axis, and the degree of abuse, which can be explicit or implicit and is on the horizontal axis. This results in 4 distinct categories of hate speech, as this matrix illustrates. So we've got explicit hate towards an individual, explicit hate towards a group, implicit hate towards an individual, and implicit hate towards a group. So Adam's going to take you through our methodology.
Okay, we made our observations on Facebook and Twitter. We attempted to limit them to mainstream social media and to keep them organic, largely focusing on content that appeared in our feeds rather than actively seeking out hate accounts, groups, or pages. For an observation to be included, it had to fall under Davidson et al.'s broad definition of hate speech. The target needed to belong to at least one of Mundell et al.'s hate categories. And following the approach of Malmasi and Zampieri, profanity was not used as an inclusion criteria, as profane content does not in itself signify hate speech. And we didn't want to overlook more implicit examples. We largely made use of non-purposive, opportunistic, and convenience sampling, aiming to document the first 20 instances of hate speech that met our inclusion criteria. However, as a result of the largely low prevalence of explicit hate speech, we began to incorporate some purposive sampling methods, searching for articles, words, or hashtags that would be more likely to yield hate speech in the comments, or that would yield unusual and potentially enlightening cases. Here, the search strategies depended on the affordances of the respective platforms. For example, Twitter actually has some fairly advanced search features. We collected our data manually through covert observation. We documented our observations in a framework that we designed in Google Sheets, and we saved evidence in the form of screen clippings to Google Drive. All of these are available publicly in the spirit of open data, and links are available on the top right of this slide, and we'll be emailing this presentation to all participants. In terms of data analysis, being an exploratory study, we analyzed our data through several lenses to increase the likelihood of arriving at questions worthy of further research. Our analysis took place in 2 phases. The first was highly iterative and organic, where we analyzed our observation framework by eye, highlighted intriguing observations, made connections, and made links to theory. This culminated in a concept map that captured our tentative insights, and we've shared a link to that as well. The second phase of analysis included looking at the distribution of our observations across the different hate categories, coding them according to the targets, individual or generalized, as well as the degree of abuse, implicit or explicit. We mapped these to our conceptual framework and coded the implicit hate speech examples into different categories. Over to Katie.
Cool, so let's look at what we found. By analyzing our observations on the basis of hate targets, we found that in the majority of observations, so 14 out of the 20, racial groups were the targets of hate speech. So this is supported by research like that of Mondal et al., who found that the majority of hate speech on Twitter, up to 48%, was race-based. So our remaining observations revealed hate speech to be on the basis of sex, gender, and sexual orientation. By coding our observations according to target and degree of abuse and plotting these against Wasim et al.'s typology, we were able to see that 3/4 of the hate speech we observed was generalized or directed at groups. The remaining quarter was direct or aimed at individuals. So when we look at the degree of abuse to see how hate speech manifests, we can now see that 3/4 of the hate speech we observed was implicit, making use of coded language in an effort to avoid detection. The remaining quarter was explicit, containing unambiguous hate words or phrases. An example of each is provided here. So explicit hate speech, we have shoot the boer, shoot the land stealers, very unambiguous. And then implicit hate speech, I've highlighted the bit here. Transgenders stay out of women's bathroom. Well done to the school board, children are not safe. The implication there being that transgender women are not women. that they are predatory and that they pose a threat to children. By further analyzing this data on the basis of platform, an interesting result emerged. All 5 instances of explicit hate speech were observed on Twitter, while implicit hate speech was observed across both Facebook and Twitter. I'm handing over Adam now to take you through the types of implicit hate speech that we found.
So looking at our examples of implicit hate speech, we were able to identify 6 broad categories of coded language. These have been operationally defined as follows. First, we have censoring, where there has been some kind of deliberate misspelling, as in this example, or character substitutions that will be recognizable to humans, but not to machines. Next, we have circumlocution, where the wordiness can obscure intent and meaning as the perpetrator beats about the bush. Next, we've got intentional ambiguity, where the hate speech itself is indirect, distanced, and vague, and generally needs the fuller context of the thread to make sense of it. Figurative language, that's where you would commonly include, well, a common example is comparisons to animals, as in this natural habitat example. And this is commonly achieved through memes and emojis, such as racist fans sending monkey emojis to black football players, which is actually currently allowed by Twitter's algorithm. Then we have stereotyping, where a common stereotype is invoked or alluded to. And then lastly, switching language, where there is a switch to a language or a dialect that is less likely to be picked up by algorithms. And I'm so glad we have another interactive example, because the chat has been going wild. What we'd like you to do here is just, of those 6 categories, try and predict which 2 you think might have been most prevalent. And we'll give you 30 seconds or so. Shouldn't take too long.
I'm going to just wait a little bit longer before I switch to the slide so people don't copy one another. Okay, let's have a look. We have some answers. Cool, stereotypes coming up top. Language switching, censoring, intentional ambiguity tied. One for figurative language or another for stereotypes. Okay, let me switch back.
Cool.
And let's look at the answer.
Okay, so indeed, stereotyping was actually highly prevalent in our sample. We actually did allow up to 2 categories per observation, but given the nature of our sampling, we can't actually read all that much into our results, but it's interesting to see kind of how the chips fell. So the second most common we identified was intentional ambiguity. That was pretty prevalent.
Cool. So our last result here is cross-platform sharing that we thought was pretty interesting. So we documented 2 instances of cross-platform sharing in which examples of hate speech that were originally posted to other social media platforms, in this case, TikTok and Instagram, were shared to Twitter in the form of video recordings and screenshots. So while the intent of this cross-platform sharing was to express dissent and to encourage action from the community, it did also serve to increase the reach of the hate speech. And ironically, while the original posts were removed on TikTok and Instagram, these duplicates still remain up on Twitter. So this observation is supported by research findings that online hate speech is iterant, and that even when content is removed, it may find expression elsewhere, possibly on the same platform under a different name or on a different online space entirely. And this brings us to our summary. So as we mentioned in our rationale, the reason for embarking on this study was to explore how hate speech manifests and who it targets on mainstream social media. Based on our research into algorithm detection and takedown rates, we hypothesized that the prevalence of explicit hate speech on mainstream Facebook and Twitter would be relatively low, which was supported by our results. Furthermore, our prediction that the remaining hate speech would contain features that resulted in non-detection also proved to be accurate. However, given our sample size and our sampling methods, it's unlikely that these findings can be generalized. Nevertheless, our exploration has prompted the following research or the following questions, which may be avenues for future research. So first, how broadly should social media platforms define hate speech? And what impact does this definition have on automatic filtering performed by algorithms? Then, given the nuances associated with implicit hate speech, should humans have a larger role to play in the detection of online hate speech? And finally, how best could human moderators and computer algorithms be paired to identify more implicit hate speech in all its guises? Thank you very much. And there are our references. Cool. Does anybody have any questions, comments? I'm opening the chat here.
If anyone would like to unmute and ask a question verbally, that's also cool. And I realize we've also gone over time, so if you need to depart, that is also absolutely fine as well.
Thank you so much for attending. We really appreciate it. And yeah, have a good evening, everybody.
Cool. Thank you so much.